The Community Reinvestment Act, had a humanitarian-sounding purpose, which was to facilitate homeownership, but in fact, it mandated that loans be given to, unqualified borrowers, frankly. And the Fed pushed that very, very strongly on banks. If a bank was going to, particularly if a bank was going to get new branches, they have to apply to the Fed. And if they were not in compliance with the Community Reinvestment Act, meaning giving out lots of loans to essentially low-income borrowers, then their application for new branches and that kind of thing could be, kind of put on hold. Over time, the Fed more and more aggressively began, pushing banks very, very hard to make these low-income loans. So, this is going on in the 90s, and you start getting this flood of, subprime mortgages, a term we've all heard of. These subprime mortgages were then, as a lot of people know now, were packaged up in packages called collateralized debt obligations,
CDOs,
or mortgage-backed securities, just kind of fancy names for packages of mortgages. And then investment banks, sold them all over the planet. The other act that you mentioned is tied into this because during the Depression, there was a law passed called the Glass-Steagall Act, which said a commercial bank could not be the same as an investment bank. A commercial bank being like Wells Fargo or B of A or any of the banks that take deposits, an investment bank being something like Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers or what have you. Investment banks basically invest in or promote stocks and do those kinds of investments.
Stocks and bonds and securities.
Yes.
Okay.
So the Glass-Steagall Act was passed because they didn't want banks taking depositors' money and gambling with them in the stock market or the bond market or the currency markets. And it kept those two kinds of institutions separate for 70 years. Along comes Greenspan and Robert Rubin and Larry Summers, who's now hanging out in the Obama White House, and they basically undid that law. They
repealed it.
They took it off the books, which is a very difficult thing to do, I hasten to add. I mean, getting a law through Congress is tough. Getting one off the books is even tougher. But they lobbied at the highest levels, and they got that removed, which enabled commercial banks and investment banks to become one. And so these packaging of subprime mortgages was something that an investment bank could do within its own structure. And you have, for instance, Goldman Sachs packaging these things up and selling them off, Citigroup doing it, and several other investment banks in Wall Street. So when you kind of look at the sequence of things, and there's another article in the book, another chapter in the book, which actually talks about an earlier beginning to these real estate mortgages, but that's what those two acts did, and that's how they were involved in this mess.
So it creates the opening and the instrumentation for everything that we are seeing now.
Yes.
And experiencing now.
Yes, it provided channels so that could occur. That's correct.
You speak about another instrument called the Waiver of Capital Requirements being a critical key in how this whole thing has been empowered and designed to happen.
Yeah, well, interestingly, the head of Goldman Sachs in, I forget the exact date, I don't have it in my head, but as these subprime mortgages were rolling forward, the head of Goldman Sachs went to the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and this relationship between the New York Fed and the New York banks is extremely incestuous. It's like the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA. I mean, they're just buddies. And they went in there, and there were certain capital requirements that the investment banks were supposed to maintain, which kept their lending leverage down. And in other words, to make it simply understood, hopefully simply understood, the more capital that the bank had to have on hand, the safer it was in case something went bad. They had capital reserves to fall back on. But the head of Goldman Sachs, a name that will become infamous in 21st century history, Henry Paulson, who later became the Secretary of Treasury and jammed the $1 trillion stimulus through Congress in 2008. But at the time, he was head of Goldman Sachs, and he went down and basically jawboned the SEC to remove the capital requirements which enabled the investment banks to further the lending or the selling of these mortgage-backed securities. So they could leverage themselves in much greater numbers than they were able to previously. All these things kind of went together. You have the Community Reinvestment Act, which forced the banks to make subprime loans. And then you have Glass-Steagall, which allows the commercial banks and the investment banks to get together. And then you have the
repeal of Glass-Steagall.
The repeal of Glass-Steagall. Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And then you have this lowering of capital requirements, all of which kind of enables this superhighway of hundreds of billions of dollars of junk debt to be flogged to banks around the planet. And that's how banks got pregnant with, toxic assets.
How does this tie into Basel I and Basel II? Well, Basel II.
That's the hammer. Basel II, and Basel is named after, that name comes from Basel or Basel, Switzerland, which is where the Bank for International Settlements is. And they issued a edict called Mark to the Market. And while that rule sounds good, it says that banks have to kind of have a similar a pricing of their assets similar to other assets. What happened here is you have these banks full of this toxic paper, and Mark to the Market says, like, if the value of Lehman Brothers subprime mortgages now goes to 10 cents on the dollar, the Mark to Market rule mandated that other banks had to value their assets the same way, regardless of whether their assets were paying or not, regardless of whether people were paying the mortgages in these subprime packages or not. If this bank's portfolio sinks down, and Lehman Brothers was clearly taken down, that's another story, but clearly taken down, then all the rest of the banks had to value or devalue these billions and billions and billions in assets. When they devalued their assets, it basically wiped out their capital structure, and the credit markets froze.
So a bank has no sovereignty, really, in the sense of it's not an independent organism. It is ruled by this tyrannical organism, this other organism that says it has jurisdiction over everything that's called a bank, and whatever it decides, if it decides its value is shredded by 100 points, then that's what happens by decree.
That is what happened, and that's what you're exactly right, and that's what Mark to the Market was and is. And when that rule got promulgated by the Bank for International Settlements, all of a sudden the assets of the banks around the planet that were holding these things, and Goldman Sachs and others, sold them by the hundreds of billions. All of a sudden their asset category is trash, and lending froze, and that is the so-called financial crisis. What caused it? What was the spark? You have all these other things leading up to it, but the spark or the hammer was this rule promulgated from the Bank for International Settlements called Basel II, which was this mark-to-market rule.
Is it true that the SEC has some say in any of this, or they have no say in any of this? What's the SEC's role in this whole equation?
Well, the SEC was very involved in this, Kim.